Hey everybody, welcome to Inside Story with Dr. Brad. I'm Brad Glenn, and today we're going to talk about something different, and that is how to bring your dog to Hawaii. So we've been coming to Hawaii for years and years, and usually just for a few weeks. So we'd always leave Daisy at home with friends or family, and we got a vacation home over here a couple years ago and started spending more time. So we finally decided to bring her. It just became too difficult to leave her for 1 or 2 months, even though she was with people who loved her and she was well taken care of. We just missed her too much. So since I just went through the process, I wanted to share that with you all, because any of you who have looked into this know that this can be just a really confusing and complicated process. And so in this video, I will go over with you the three aspects of bringing your dog to Hawaii that are really important. And that first one being rabies vaccination and rabies titer testing, because this is what determines how long it'll take you to get your dog to Hawaii. Depending on the rabies status of your pet, that will give you your basic timeline on how long it's going to take. And in the best case scenario, I'm here to tell you you can do it in as little as 30 days. For example, from the day I decided to try to bring Daisy, it was 36 days for us. Getting to 30 days would be very tough, but it's possible to do it in 34 or 35 days, depending on your specific situation. So we'll go through that, timing, and we'll go through paperwork and logistics. And there are a couple of insights that I discovered during the process that I think will make it much more simpler for you. When you first look at this online, it just looks overwhelming, to be honest. And a lot of people get discouraged right away because it seems impossible almost with all the regulations and paperwork. So we'll go through all that, and then you can decide for yourself if you want to try to bring your dog to Hawaii. So stay with us and we'll get to it. Okay, so let's talk about rabies vaccinations and rabies testing. So the whole reason this is so complicated in Hawaii is because Hawaii doesn't have rabies in the state. It's never come to the state. So they do everything they can to prevent rabies from getting to the island. So for that reason, the requirements are very strict. The first requirement is that your dog has to have had, or cat, this applies to dogs and cats, same rules. Your dog has to have had 2 rabies vaccinations in their lifetime, and the most recent one has to be current, meaning these rabies vaccines are usually good for either a year or 3 years, and so it can't be beyond that time period when your last vaccination was done. So in other words, if they had a 3-year vaccine a year ago, then you're fine because you have 3 years. So the last one has to be current, but there does have to have been one prior. And you have to have the paperwork for those. They require the rabies certificate, which is the paper that the veterinarian gives you that is signed by the veterinarian. So keep that in mind. You need to look, hopefully you can find. Now, if your dog has had 2 rabies vaccinations and the most recent one is current, then you are in this window where you could possibly do this in 30 days to 30 to 40 days is definitely doable. So the time limiting step in this situation is the rabies titer test. So in addition to the rabies vaccinations, Hawaii requires that the blood is tested to make sure that the dog has rabies antibodies. Now, this is only done at 2 laboratories in the whole United States. There's actually a third, but it's only for armed forces. So basically, it's Kansas State University and Auburn University have testing labs that do the rabies. So if your dog's in that window, if they're current on their rabies and they've had 2 vaccinations and you're trying to do this quickly, the first thing you need to do is to make an appointment with the veterinarian to get rabies titer tests taken. So make that veterinarian appointment. Tell them you're going to Hawaii, and that only certain vets will do this because they have to be certified by I think it's the USDA. There's a federal entity that has to certify the vet. I'm pretty sure it's the USDA. And make that appointment, and at that appointment, you will have the rabies titer drawn and sent to the lab. The other thing you should do before or immediately after making that appointment with the vet is to check with these labs. We used Kansas State University, go KSU, rabies FAVN test, FAVN is the name of the test. And on their website, they will tell you what their current lag time is. So, for example, when we were doing it, it was 3 to 4 weeks, which was okay because it just has to be done. The result has to be obtained before you arrive in Hawaii, obviously. But also, 30 days has to have elapsed since the time the blood was drawn. So you can't get it, even if they could do it in 2 weeks, you can't have it drawn 2 weeks before you go because there's a mandatory 30-day waiting period from the time the blood is drawn. So you have to wait 30 days. So that is really the key thing that limits. Now, so if you've checked the website and the timing of the lab, if they can do it in 3 to 4 weeks, you can't go any sooner than that anyway, so that's fine. The only thing that will hold you back is if they say their wait time is 7 to 8 weeks, then you're not going to get the test result back until then. But you have to wait 30 days, so if they say their wait time is 3 to 4 weeks, well, you couldn't go to Hawaii before then anyway because Hawaii won't let you in until 30 days after the blood was drawn. So make that vet appointment, check the labs. That'll tell you if this is even possible. Now, if that looks good, the next thing you have to check is, does your dog have a microchip? If your dog has a microchip, that's great. They will need to check the status of it at the vet appointment. It has to be working, and there's certain requirements. It has to be a fairly modern chip. I guess there were some chips that are compatible that are maybe from a long, long time ago, but most microchips should be fine. Now, if your dog doesn't have a microchip, then at that first vet appointment, when they draw the blood, you'll have to have a microchip implanted at that time as well. And that's no big deal. It takes like 5 minutes. The fees are not that much. I think the microchip is $70. But it is something that you will have to make sure gets done at that first vet appointment. So that's a story with rabies vaccinations and the rabies titer. Now let's talk about paperwork. There are basically only 2 things that you really need as far as paperwork. It sounds really complicated when you look online, but it's really only 2 things. Number 1 are those rabies vaccination certificates that you hopefully have from your veterinarian for the 2 rabies vaccinations. Now, I know they're adamant about having the hard copy of the current one, the most recent one that's current. But the older one, I think there's a little wiggle room. I can't remember exactly what it says, but there is some accommodation if you don't have the paperwork, if it's been documented somewhere, bring some documentation of a prior rabies test. You might get away with not having the old one, but I would check. Call the number if there's any question for the state of Hawaii, the department that takes care of this whole process. They have a phone number on their website, and you can. It's not easy to get through, but you can usually get through if you're persistent and ask them a question. So, first piece of paperwork are the 2 rabies vaccination certificates. The second thing that you absolutely need is what's called a health certificate, and that has to be done at a second visit to your veterinarian at least 14 days before you arrive in Hawaii. So I'd recommend doing it 7 to 10 days before your departure date. Give you a little wiggle room in case your flight gets canceled, in case there's a delay. You don't want to have it expire and have to go back to the vet because they're adamant about 14 days. So a week to 10 days before you schedule a second visit with your veterinarian for the health certificate, and at that time they just do a basic health check, examine your dog, and they also will apply, they must apply a flea and tick treatment, and it has to be administered by the veterinarian, and it has to be documented in this health certificate. Once you have those, you are good to go as far as paperwork. There's a form that you have to fill out online, they say, but that's only if you are going to send your paperwork in ahead of time. And that leads us to our next topic, which is logistics. So in logistics, I'm going to tell you why you don't necessarily need to fill out that piece of paper. Okay? Stick with us. Okay, let's talk about logistics. What's the easiest way to do this? This is where you have some choices to make, and I'm going to share with you 2 tricks that I think will markedly simplify the process for you. So when you go on the website for the state of Hawaii, they have 2 checklists regarding whether you're flying into Honolulu or whether you're flying into the outer islands. Now, what I want to tell you is, if you try to fly to the outer islands, you can do it, but it makes the whole process more complicated. Number one, you have to get all your paperwork in to Hawaii 30 days in advance. Number two, they don't have a state inspector at the airport. You have to hire a private veterinarian to come to the airport and meet you there. And that, to me, just adds a whole nother level of complexity. It adds cost, but more importantly, it adds uncertainty. This veterinarian has to show up. You've got to also satisfy whatever their requirements are, as far as they're doing you a service, and they call the shots on what they want from you before they'll schedule you to come to to have an appointment at the airport. So my advice is, at least your first time, don't even try to fly to the outer islands. You can, if you're going to Kona, going to Maui, going to Kauai, just do a connecting flight into Honolulu. Your dog will get cleared in Honolulu, and then give yourself 3 hours, and get a little layover there to catch your flight to the outer island. You don't need to stay there overnight, but your life will be much easier if you fly to Honolulu. If you fly to Honolulu, they say that you need your paperwork submitted 10 days before arrival. But the truth is, that's not true. You can show up and hand carry your paperwork, and that's what I did. And the reason I did that is because they require hard copies. If those get lost in the mail, now you have a big problem. I just wanted to bring my paperwork with me. So I'm bringing those rabies vaccinations and the health certificate, hand carrying those. I don't send anything in advance. And you bring that with you to the animal quarantine station where they're inspecting your dog. You don't have to have a private vet come when you fly into Honolulu, because they have a state officer there that does the inspections. So that simplifies the process. All you have to do is show up with your paperwork, and you have to have had your blood test and make sure your blood test is back. Now, the state of Hawaii does have a way you can check by microchip number. You can go to the state of Hawaii, the animal quarantine department, and you can see if they have received your Favin rabies titer for your dog's microchip number. And I recommend doing that before you leave. You make sure that it's in their file. So this makes it much simpler if you, regardless of which island you're going to, fly into Honolulu and hand carry your paperwork. The cost of hand carrying your paperwork is like $60. The charge is $185, I think, if you send the paperwork in 10 days in advance. And I think it's $240 if you hand carry it. So there's a $60 penalty, more or less. But for me, this whole process is going to cost you minimum $600 to $1,000, not including airline fees. Regardless, so $60 really doesn't move the needle, but it gives you the ability to take the pressure off getting that paperwork and sending it in. hand carry it in and pay the extra 60 bucks. So let's talk about what happens when you get to the airport. So you fly, if you have your pet in the cabin with you, what happened for us is they do an announcement right before landing that if you have a pet, that their agent will meet you at the top of the jetway. Initially, the flight attendant said, stay in your seat, let everybody deplane, and somebody will come to you. But then somebody came on the overhead and said, if you have a pet, go to the top of the gate, jetway, and somebody would meet you there. So basically, they have an airline employee meet you, and they walk with you to the animal quarantine station where they do the pet inspection. And that was about a 15-minute walk. It's between the two terminals. And for us, there was nobody there, so we didn't have to wait. The other thing is that department closes, I think, at 5:30, so you have to time your flight to arrive. Try to get in, 2 or 3 o'clock at the latest. The earlier the better, but if you get in at 2 or 3, you have plenty of time before they close at 5, even if if there are people in front of you and you have to wait. So that's the process to get to Honolulu. Once your animal is in Honolulu and you've been cleared, then they give you your dog or cat, and you can jump on your next flight. And there's no paperwork, there's no requirements for traveling inter-island, so you can fly inter-island as much as you want. So for us, we arrived in Honolulu around 2 p.m. We were done with animal quarantine by about 3:30, 3:45. We had a quick bite to eat, and then we boarded our plane for Kona at 5 o'clock. So now let's talk about what if your dog isn't current on rabies. Okay, so if your dog has had a rabies, let's say they had a rabies vaccination, but it's expired, you're going to have to get another rabies shot. And that's going to add a minimum of 30 days to the process. So now you're at 60 days minimum, and another vet appointment, because you're going to have to make a vet appointment to get the rabies shot, wait at least 30 days, and then do the rest of the process. Make that other vet appointment for the blood titer, the Favin rabies blood titer, microchip if necessary. If you don't have a microchip, you can get it done on the very first appointment. But that's what happens if you've only had one vaccination. If your dog hasn't had any vaccinations, then you add another 30 days, because the vaccinations can't be closer than 30 days to each other. So if your dog has no vaccinations, you would add another 60 days on top of the 30 days. So now you're looking at a minimum of 90 days and another vet appointment. So let's talk about cost. How much does this whole endeavor cost? Well, it really depends, because as you can see, there are a lot of variables. It depends on the rabies status of your pet. It depends on whether you're going to try to fly into Honolulu or the outer islands, which again, I really recommend just getting your dog cleared through Honolulu. It will be cheaper and faster and easier. But let's say if you're current on your rabies vaccinations, you have to have 2 vet appointments. You've got the Favin test. The vet appointments are going to be $100 each probably. For the rabies blood test, our vet charged $250. I think the lab itself is, what Kansas State and Auburn charges probably less than $100. It's like $80. But obviously the vet has labor, and they're going to charge you for that. I've heard people paying as much as $400 or $500, so I thought $250 was pretty reasonable. I'm sure you can check around if you have the luxury. The other issue, though, is you need to really understand this process, because not all veterinarians, even if they're certified to be able to fill out this paperwork, if they mess it up, you're going to be stuck, trying to get into Hawaii, and they're not going to let your dog in if things aren't right. So you really have to be proactive and explain to the veterinarian exactly what needs to be done. And so you need to get those checklists, read through those, and be very proactive about working with your veterinarian and making sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed. Okay, so if you're talking about the total cost, couple vet appointments, say $200 or $300 for the rabies titer, you're at about 500. The fee for the state of Hawaii when you arrive in Honolulu, if you hand carry your paperwork, is $240. So you're at about, I was probably at about $700, not including airline fees. So depending on where you're flying from, most airlines charge you per segment of flight. So it can add up pretty quick. It's usually $125 per trip. So yeah, it can get expensive. So I would say on the low end, you could probably 600, and on the higher end, probably 1,000. And I think, that's probably the range that you're dealing with before airline flights. Now, just a word on if you come back, it's going to be easier. The FAVN, the blood test, the rabies blood test, is good for 3 years. So if you keep your dog current on the rabies vaccinations, which you should, then you don't have to redo the blood test. You're really only going to have to repeat. You have to have the health certificate every time you come in. So if you come back within 3 years of that original blood test, all you have to do is get that one vet appointment 14 days before you arrive with the health certificate. And if you have a new rabies certificate, because in the meantime your dog has gotten another rabies test, or another rabies vaccination, I should say, then you bring that new rabies certificate as well. So that's all you need when you come back is health certificate and any additional rabies vaccine certificate, and the fee is only $100. So they keep everything else in the system. So when you come back, the process is going to be much quicker. So if you come here on a regular basis, say every year for a couple months, once you get through the first process, everything's going to be a lot smoother. And so that's one of the reasons I decided to do it, bite the bullet and just do it. I wanted to learn the process and become familiar with it. And so when we come back, it's going to be much smoother and less expensive. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was helpful. If you like this, please hit the like button. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to ask below, and I'll try to get back to everyone and answer any questions you have. Best of luck to you. Aloha.